Hey guys, it's Miss Navert again. So the last time we spoke, we read chapters 32 through 34. So now today we're going to pick up with chapters 35 through 37, 36. What did I say in my plan? Let's make sure. 36, okay? So we are going to read chapters 35 through 36. The last time that we read, and wait, before I even say this, if you have not listened to chapters 32 through 34, please pause this video, go back and listen to it. It's in the Zoom meeting from Friday on May 8th. So make sure that you go back and you listen to chapters 32 through 34 and send me your questions before you listen to chapters 35 through 36. Got it? Okay. So, the last time we spoke, Zero had run away from camp, and then Stanley had suddenly gone after him, and suddenly Stanley was standing beside Sam the Onion Man's old boat titled Mary Lou, and an orange hand reached out from under the boat. So we're assuming that that orange jumpsuit and hand is Zero. So let's see what happens. All right, Holes by Louis Sachar, chapter 35. Zero's face looked like a jack-o'-lantern that had been left out too many days past Halloween. Half rotten, with sunken eyes and a drooping smile. "Is that water?" he asked. His voice was weak and raspy. His lips were so pale they were almost white, and his tongue seemed to flop around uselessly in his mouth as he spoke, as if it kept getting in the way. "It's empty," Stanley said. He stared at Zero, not quite believing what he was real. "I tried to bring you the whole water truck, but..." He smiled sheepishly. "I drove it into a hole." "I can't believe you're..." "Me neither," said Zero. "Come on, we gotta get back to camp." Zero shook his head. "I'm not going back." "You have to. We both have to." "You want some sploosh?" Zero asked. "What?" Zero shaded his eyes with his forearm. "It's cooler under the boat," he said. Stanley watched Zero crawl back through his hole. It was a miracle he was still alive, but Stanley knew he would have to get him back to camp soon, even if he had to carry him. He crawled after him and was just able to squeeze his body through the hole. He never would have fit through there the first time when he first came to Camp Green Lake. He's lost a lot of weight. As he pulled himself through, his leg got stuck on something sharp and hard. It was a shovel. For a second, Stanley wondered how it got out there, but then remembered that Zero had taken it with him after striking Mr. Pendanski. It was cooler under the boat, which was half buried in the dirt. There were enough cracks and holes in the bottom of the boat, now the roof, to provide light and ventilation. He could see empty jars scattered about. Zero held a jar in his hand and grunted as he tried to unscrew the lid. "What is it?" "Sploosh." His voice was strained as he worked on the jar. "That's what I call it. They were buried under the boat." He still couldn't get the lid off. "I found 16 jars. Here, hand me the shovel." Stanley didn't have a lot of room to move. He reached behind him, grabbed the wooden end of the shovel, and held it out to Zero blade first. "Sometimes you have to," Zero said. Then he hit the jar against the blade of the shovel, breaking the top of the jar clean off. He quickly brought the jar to his mouth, licking the sploosh off the jagged edges before it spilled. "Careful," Stanley warned. Zero picked up the cracked lid and licked the sploosh off that as well. Then he handed the broken jar to Stanley. "Drink some." Stanley held it in his hand and stared at it a moment. He was afraid of the broken glass. He was also afraid of the sploosh. It looked like mud. Whatever it was, he realized it must have been in the boat when the boat sank. That meant it was probably over 100 years old. Who knew what kind of bacteria was living in it? "It's good," said Zero, encouraging him. He wondered if Zero had heard of bacteria. He raised the jar to his mouth and took a sip, carefully. It was warm, bubbly, Mushy nectar, sweet and tangy. It felt like heaven as it flowed over his dried mouth and down his parched throat. He thought it must have been some kind of fruit at some time. Perhaps peaches. Peaches. Zero smiled at him. I told you it was good. Stanley didn't want to drink too much, but it was too good to resist. They passed the jar back and forth until it was empty. How many are left? He asked. None, said Zero. Stanley's mouth dropped. Now, I have to take you back, he said. I'm not digging any more holes, said Zero. They won't make you dig, Stanley promised. They'll probably send you to a hospital like Barfbag. Barfbag stepped on a rattlesnake, said Zero. Stanley remembered how he'd almost done the same. I guess he didn't hear that rattle. He did it on purpose, said Zero. You think? He took off his shoe and his sock first. Stanley shivered as he tried to imagine it. What is Maryaluo? Asked Zero. What? Zero concentrated hard. Maryaluo. I have no idea. I'll show you, said Zero. He crawled back out from under the boat. Stanley followed. Back outside, he had to shield his eyes from the brightness. Zero walked around to the back of the boat and pointed to the upside-down letters. M-R-Y-L-O. Stanley smiled. Mary Lou. It's the name of the boat. Mary Lou, Zero repeated, studying the letters. I thought Y made the Y sound. It does, said Stanley, but not when it's at the end of the word. Sometimes Y is a vowel, and sometimes it's a consonant. Zero suddenly groaned. He grabbed his stomach and bent over. Are you all right? Zero dropped to the ground. He lay on his side, with his knees pulled up to his chest. He continued to groan. Stanley watched helplessly. He wondered if it was the sploosh. He looked back towards Camp Green Lake. At least he thought it was the direction of Camp Green Lake. He wasn't entirely sure. Zero stopped moaning, and his body slowly unbent. I'm taking you back, said Stanley. Zero managed to sit up. He took several deep breaths. Look, I got a plan so you won't get in trouble, Stanley assured him. Remember when I found that gold tube? Remember I gave it to X-Ray and the warden went crazy, making us dig where she thought X-Ray found it? I think if I tell her the warden where I really found it, she'll let us off. I'm not going back, said Zero. You've got nowhere else to go, said Stanley. Zero said nothing. You'll die out here, said Stanley. Then I'll die out here. Stanley didn't know what to do. He'd come to rescue Zero and instead drank the last of his sploosh. He looked off to the distance. I want you to look at something. I just want you to look at the top of the mountain there. See the one with something sticking out of it? Yeah, I think. What does it look like to you? Does it look like anything? Zero said nothing. But as he studied the mountain, his right hand slowly formed into a fist, and he raised his thumb. His eyes went from the mountain to his hand, and then back to the mountain. Chapter 36. They put 4 of the unbroken jars in the burlap sack, in case they might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack. Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said. I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other a thumbs-up sign, and then headed out. It was the hottest part of the day. Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back to the water truck and wished he'd at least stop and fill the canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach as he let himself fall to the ground. Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but it was now destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would be before he, too, felt the effects. He looked at Big Thumb. It didn't seem any closer when they first started. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. "Can you walk?" Stanley asked him. "Just give me a second," Zero said. He took another breath, then using the shovel, pulled himself back up to his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs up sign, and they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at Big Thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked, and then would wait 10 minutes before looking at it again to see if it was closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And if they ever reached it, he realized, they'd still have to climb it. "Wonder who she was," said Zero. "Who?" "Mary Lou," said Zero. Stanley smiled. "I guess she was once a real person on a real lake. It's kind of hard to imagine, isn't it?" "I bet she was pretty," said Zero. "Somebody must have loved her a lot to name a boat after her." "Yeah," said Stanley. "I bet she looked great in a bathing suit, sitting on the boat while her boyfriend rowed." Now, who was Mary Lou? Wasn't Mary Lou the donkey? Zero used the shovel as a third leg. 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. "I got to stop and rest," he said after a while. Stanley looked at Big Thumb. It still wasn't any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get up again. "We're almost there," he said. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. "I really have to sit down." "It's just see if you can go a little." Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction of a second longer before perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade. Then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head on the ground. Stanley could hear a very low moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel and couldn't help but think that he might need to dig a grave, Zero's last hole. "And who will dig a grave for me?" he thought. But Zero did get up, once again flashing the thumbs up sign. "Give me words," he said weakly. It took Stanley a few seconds to realize what he meant. Then he smiled, and he spelled R-U-N. Zero sounded it out to himself. Run. Run. Good. F-U-N. Un. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on beside his pain and weakness. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time he looked up at Big Thumb, it really did seem closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was dry. He was weak and exhausted, yet, as bad as he felt, he knew that Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. It was possible, he hoped, that he didn't get any of the bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe the bacteria was only in the jars, which opened easily, the ones he was now carrying in his sack. What scared Stanley the most about dying wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. It wouldn't be much worse than what he'd felt now. In fact, maybe at times in his moment of death, he would feel too weak to feel pain. Death would be a relief. What worried him the most was the thought of his parents not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He hated to imagine what it would be like for his mother and his father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone to look for Zero, but no one cared about Zero. They simply destroyed his files. But Stanley had family. She couldn't pretend he was not there. He wondered what she would tell them and when. "What do you think's up there?" Zero asked. Stanley looked at the top of Big Thumb. "Oh, probably an Italian restaurant." He laughed. Zero managed to laugh. "I think I'll get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer," said Stanley. "I want an ice cream sundae," said Zero, "with nuts and whipped cream and bananas and hot fudge." The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumb pointed upwards towards it. They came to the end of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose up before them. Unlike the eastern shore, where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope down gradually. It was as if they had been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had to somehow climb up out of it. They could no longer see Big Thumb. The cliffs blocked their view. The cliffs also blocked the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. "I'm all right," he whispered. Stanley saw a rut, about a foot wide and 6 inches deep, running down a cliff. On either side of the rut were series of ledges. "Let's try these," he said. It looked to be about a 50-foot climb, straight up. Stanley still managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the ruts. At times he had to use the side of the rut for support in order to make it to the next ledge. Zero stayed with him somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up on a fairly wide edge. Zero came up alongside him. "You okay?" Stanley asked. Zero gave the thumbs up sign. Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was about 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. "Give me a boost," said Zero. "Then I'll pull you up with the shovel." "You won't be able to pull me up," said Stanley. "Yes, I will," said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together, and Zero stepped on his interwoven fingers. He was able to lift Zero high enough for him to grab the protruding slab of rock. Stanley continued to help him from below as Zero pulled himself up onto the ledge. While Zero was getting himself situated up there, Stanley attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap. He held it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed the hold of the sack and then the shovel. He set the shovel so that half of the blade was supported by the rock slab. The wooden shaft hung down towards Stanley. "Okay," he said. Stanley doubted this would work. It was one thing for him to lift Zero, who was half his weight. It was quite another for Zero to try to pull him up. Stanley grabbed hold of the shovel as he climbed up the rock wall, using the sides of the ruts to help support him. His hands moved over one another up the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hand clasp his wrists. He let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed the top of the ledge. He gathered his strength for a brief second, seemed to defy gravity as he took a quick step up the wall and with Zero's help pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way he could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist. It took him a moment to realize that it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes in both hands. He had held on to the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley climbed. Zero brought both of his hands to his mouth and sucked up his blood. One of the jars had broken in the sack. They decided to save the pieces. They might need a knife or something. They rested briefly and then continued on up. It was a fairly easy climb for the rest of the way. When they reached the flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a fiery ball balancing on the top of a big thumb. God was twirling a basketball. Soon they were walking along the thin shadow of the thumb. All right. So chapter 37 is where we'll pick up next on Wednesday when we have a live Zoom meeting at 10 a.m. Okay, so this coming Wednesday, we'll read chapters 37 through, I believe, 40, and we will see what happens after this on Wednesday. So now go back to your daily email and answer your questions, and I hope you are as interested in this story as I am. It's such a good one. All right, guys, I'll see you guys on Wednesday, and have a great day.